Good evening and welcome to Trinity, to our Bible study, and a warm welcome to those who are joining us again online. I hope God blesses you tonight as you hear his word. Now last week, if you remember, we ended by hearing that Jerusalem had become so bad that she made her sisters, Sodom and Samaria, look positively righteous. And with God promising to establish a new covenant, not only with Israel, but with all the nations. And we heard that also that Jerusalem would become ashamed of their past behavior, and the cities that had been called her sisters would now be called like daughters to her. And that was the end of chapter 16. So I'm going to read now the first 8 verses of chapter 17. So that's Ezekiel chapter 17 and verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, set forth an allegory and tell the house of Israel a parable. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. A great eagle with powerful wings, long feathers, and a full plumage of varied colors came to Lebanon. Taking hold of the top of a cedar, he broke off its topmost shoot and carried it away to a land of merchants, where he planted it in a city of traders. He took some of the seed of your land and put it in fertile soil. He planted it like a willow by abundant water, and it sprouted and became a low spreading vine. Its branches turned towards him, but its roots remained under it. So it became a vine and produced branches and put forth leafy boughs. But there was another great eagle with powerful wings and full plumage. The vine now sent out its roots towards him from the plot where it was planted and stretched out its branches to him for water. It had been planted in good soil by abundant water, so it would produce branches, bear fruit, and become a splendid vine. Okay, so God tells Ezekiel to put an allegory or a parable before the people. In other words, he was told to give them a message, but in the form of a riddle. And in a way, a parable as well. The riddle was meant to be a little puzzling to understand. That was the intention. And the parable part of it was intended to be a story, illustrating spiritual and material truths. So Ezekiel puts forward this allegory as he's told, but once again he makes sure that the people know that these are the words of God. With the words, once again, the word of the Lord came to me, so that the people have got no doubt that this message is not coming from Ezekiel, it's coming from God. And once again, God is talking to what was primarily the kingdom of Judah, but also the house of Israel as a whole. And this, we'll call it an allegory for now, starts by describing a great eagle with powerful wings and full plumage and long feathers and varied colors in its plumage. Now, as I was researching this, interestingly, the Babylonians worshipped a god who was named Nisroch. And he was depicted as an eagle-headed deity with wings and exaggerated muscles. So already we start to see something coming out of this allegory. Now, it doesn't take too much imagination on our part to work out that this great eagle is symbolic of the kingdom of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. The powerful wings speaks of the strength of his empire. The long feathers and the full plumage, the colorful plumage, speaks of the varied and many nations that he has so far conquered. And we read that this eagle took the top from a cedar tree. Now, it's no accident that that allegory mentions a cedar tree, because elsewhere in the Bible, the cedar tree is indicative, referring to the royal family of Judah. But it's also a figure of speech used to describe the Davidic line of kings, which culminated in the Messiah. So, this allegory, the twig that was snapped from the top of the cedar tree by the eagle, refers to the king Jehoiakim, who was the head of the royal family of Judah. In this allegory, the twig is snapped off and taken to a land of merchants. And this refers to the time when Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, was taken by Nebuchadnezzar to captivity in Babylon, which was a land of merchants. Now, Jehoiakim, the king taken into exile, was also known as Jeconiah. And if you look at Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, and verse 11, it reads, and I quote, "And Josiah, the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of exile." So here we have this king, Jeconiah, who is part of the line that is going to end in the Messiah, being taken into captive. So it seems that even at this time, God is protecting this royal line, this line that is going to culminate in the Messiah. He is protecting that by taking him away out of the catastrophe that is going to fall on Jerusalem. He's protecting, if you like, the line of descent to Jesus. Even during a time that Israel is being punished for rebellion and idolatry, for Jerusalem is about to get its comeuppance, God is still thinking about and protecting the line of the Messiah. Now, as we talked last week about people's image of God being a vindictive God, always angry and all that, that is another example of a God who is not angry and vindictive, because even now he is protecting. It's obviously this is part of a plan. God has got this plan and he's working it out even in the middle of punishing people who are guilty of idolatry. Verse 5, for the seed of the land. Now, when you read for the seed of the land, read people, the people of the land, natives as opposed to foreigners. And in this case, the eagle planting some of the seed of the land in fertile soil refers to the fact that Nebuchadnezzar chose Zedekiah to rule the land, to rule Jerusalem instead of Jehoiakim, who had now been carted off to exile. Matthew Henry puts it like this: this was one of the seed of the land, a native, not a foreigner, not one of his Babylonian princes. He was planted in a fruitful field, for so Jerusalem as yet was. He placed it by great waters, where it would be likely to grow, like a willow tree which grows quickly and grows best in moist ground, but is never designed or expected to be a stately tree. He set it with care and circumspection. He wisely provided that it might grow, but it might not grow too big. He took the king's seed and made a covenant with him that he should have the kingdom and enjoy the regal power and dignity, provided he held to his vassal, dependent on him and accountable to him. So Zedekiah has been appointed king instead of Jehoiakim, who's been carted off. He's given all the rights and privileges of the role of king, as long as he remembers his place. He's still subservient to the land of Babylon, to Nebuchadnezzar. And as long as he remembers that, he's going to stay in this position of king of this little empire. So this seed, which had been planted in fertile ground with good water supply, it grew into a low spreading vine, representing all Jerusalem. It did grow and flourish for a while. So, in other words, having been made king by Nebuchadnezzar, Zedekiah and Jerusalem did what they were supposed to be doing. And it did flourish. He exercised this power he had been given whilst under the authority of Nebuchadnezzar. And to continue the allegory, it was always intended that this vine, the king of Israel and Jerusalem, would grow and produce good fruit. And this was for the benefit of Nebuchadnezzar. That's why he put the king there, to make sure that this little kingdom flourished. And in flourishing, he could keep on claiming taxes. He could keep on taking his share of the goodies of the land, of the fat of the land, of the crops and the produce and all that. That was the whole idea behind this little kingdom being successful, with a king that he had put there as subservient to him, Nebuchadnezzar. And Zedekiah was enjoying all the privileges of being king of this little empire. And so it would go on as long as he remembers his place. But then we read of a second large and powerful eagle coming onto the scene. And this low vine, Israel, Jerusalem, starts to send out its branches towards this new eagle. And this new eagle in the allegory represents Egypt. And the vine spreading its root out towards it represents Zedekiah's attempts to reach out to them, Israel, to Egypt, for help in overcoming Babylon and removing themselves from under the Babylonian yoke. And we know from history that Zedekiah did renege on this deal he made with Nebuchadnezzar, and he did look to Egypt for help. And that is why the catastrophic events that Ezekiel is prophesying are coming about. That is why this is going to land on Jerusalem's head, because he didn't know his place, because he didn't stay where he was and do as the Babylonian king had told him to. Had Zedekiah remained faithful to this oath to Nebuchadnezzar, and indeed to his higher allegiance to God, Israel might have been fruitful and prosperous as a small independent kingdom. But as it was, Zedekiah's behavior, his treachery, if I can use that word, became just another example of not only Israel and Judah, but Jerusalem's inability to recognize where their loyalty should lie, to recognize where their allegiance should be. It became just another example of their willingness, if you like, to coin a modern phrase, to bite the hand that feeds them. But then if they'd ever kept their eyes on the one true God in the first place, they would not have found themselves in this mess at all. But even now, in trouble as they are, under the yoke of the Babylonians, they still don't turn to God for help. They still haven't learned. They turn to their neighbor Egypt. And don't forget, Egypt was the very nation that put them all in captivity in the first place and held them as slaves for so long. And still they are turning to Egypt for help to come out from underneath this Babylonian yoke. And you know, I found an interesting fact when I was researching this. I found a news article which apparently is from about 10 years ago, published by an apparently well-known news source in America. And it's headed New York. And it goes like this. Representatives from the sports drink manufacturer Powerade announced on Wednesday that Nisroch, the ancient Assyrian god of agriculture, has been resurrected from the depths of the Assyro-Babylonian Empire and mythology to serve as the key marketing figure for their newest product called Nisroch, Eagle Heart Extreme Whirlwind. According to officials, the eagle-headed farming deity, once a source of strength and comfort to ancient Assyrians, is the perfect symbol for athletes looking to take their game to the next level. This name Nisroch is synonymous with power, a statement from Powerade read in part. And this drink, with its new extreme whirlwind formula, will allow athletes to experience what it must have been like for Nisroch to soar over Assyria and bring those who dared to challenge him to their knees. Just like Nisroch needed courage to protect all who worshipped him, the statement continued, Eagle Heart will give you the eagle-like courage you need to produce extreme results on the court, on the baseball diamond, or in the weight room. Let me ask you the question, have we learned our lesson? Obviously not. It's astonishing, really, isn't it? You know, all the information we've got in here, all the lessons that are there for us, it's all written there. Do we learn from other people's mistakes? No. We make the same mistakes over and over again. It's astonishing. Okay, let's read verses 9 and 10. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Will it thrive? Will it not be uprooted and stripped of its fruit so that it withers? All its new growth will wither. It will not take a strong arm or many people to pull it up by the roots. Even if it is transplanted, will it thrive? Will it not wither completely when the east wind strikes it, wither away in the plot where it grew? Okay, so speaking through Ezekiel still, God asks the question, will it thrive? You know, it was not for the want of necessities of life that Zedekiah revolted. It wasn't really because of oppression on the part of Nebuchadnezzar that caused Zedekiah to revolt. The primary root behind Zedekiah's revolt was gratuitous ambition, pride, and ingratitude. Let's be honest, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, had put him in a place where he could have had anything he wanted. As long as he toed the line, he could have been king of this empire. He could have had all the food he wanted, all the drink he wanted, all the servants he wanted. So it was obviously not lack that drove him to this rebellion. It was simply pride and ingratitude, selfish ambition. The commentator Benson puts it like this: can it be that such breach of faith and such ingratitude should prosper? No, it cannot be. God will never suffer it. Zedekiah, besides the obligation of an oath, was bound to the king of Babylon by the ties of gratitude, as he owed him all that he possessed. And that's true, because everything Zedekiah had, he had it because Nebuchadnezzar allowed him to have it. Will it not be stripped of its fruit, the word says. Now, I'm no gardener. Those who know me will know that. I don't even like waving the watering can around the flowers. That's my wife's job. She's the gardener. But I do know that when you put a plant in the ground, a flower, a vine or a bush or a tree, whatever, you expect it to grow and behave in a certain way based on what you've planted. Now, if it starts growing outside of that spectrum of expected behavior, then it's considered to be getting out of control. And under such circumstances, I'm assured that it's either trimmed, or if it's really out of control, it's rooted up and thrown away. And I've done that before now, and the flowers as well. But that's another story. I've got an app on my phone now which I can scan the leaf and it tells me whether it's a weed or a flower, so I don't put anything else up that I shouldn't do. Yeah. It's called self-protection too, because my wife kills me. And this is what is happening here, metaphorically speaking. In verse 9 and 10, when Nebuchadnezzar took some of the seed of Israel and he planted it in fertile soil next to the water, he expected that plant, Jerusalem, to behave in a particular way, to behave in a certain way. He expected this plant, Jerusalem and Zedekiah, to look to him for maintenance and support, just as a gardener would maintain and support the plants under his care. And when that didn't happen, when the plant, Jerusalem, Zedekiah, started to grow in an unexpected way, it was considered, if you like, to have got out of control. And so the vine was uprooted and stripped of its fruit. And this is a metaphor, an allegory, if you like, of what is going to happen to Jerusalem. Don't forget, Jerusalem is the vine. Its people are going to be uprooted and sent into exile, and the city will be stripped of its fruit, or for fruit read valuables. All the gold and silver and anything that the Babylonians consider valuable is going to be stripped. So this plant that in the allegory is Jerusalem is becoming out of control. It's not behaving the way the gardener, Nebuchadnezzar, thought it should be. And so he is doing something about the plant. He is uprooting it. And God asks the rhetorical question, will it survive? The plant has grown in an unexpected way. Zedekiah and Jerusalem are doing things that he wasn't expected them to do. It's getting out of control. And God asks the question, will it survive? And God hints in this word that he tells Ezekiel to give, that will Nebuchadnezzar not do what any gardener would do with an unruly plant? Pull it out. Get rid of it, throw it in the fire, strip of its fruit so it withers. And God even prophesies that it's not going to take much to pull it up. In other words, it's not going to take much of an army for Nebuchadnezzar to sort out Jerusalem and Zedekiah. To pull it out, to strip it of its fruit, and to have done with it. And God even covers an alternative scenario for this vine, that it could be uprooted and transplanted. In other words, that it might cease to be in Babylon's garden and be transplanted into Egypt's garden. And after again asking the rhetorical question, will it survive? He goes on to explain that even if it's transplanted, it wouldn't survive because of this east wind. Now, this east wind, incidentally, is often spoken of as an ill wind. And when it does strike, crops are withered and destroyed. It apparently is a brutal, dry, harsh wind that devastates crops. And in this case, the east wind that is going to destroy this vine, Jerusalem, is the armies of Babylon. They are going to be God's symbolic east wind. Nebuchadnezzar, I got him on the brain now. Matthew Henry talks about it like this. Nebuchadnezzar was pleased, for the branches turned towards him and rested on him as the vine on the wall, and he had his share of the fruits of this vine. The roots thereof too were under him and at his disposal. The Jews had reason to be pleased, for they sat under their own vine, which brought forth branches and shot forth sprigs, and looked pleasant and promising. See how gradually the judgments of God came upon this provoking people, how God gave them respite, and so gave them space to repent. He made their kingdom base, as if to try that would humble them, before he made it no kingdom at all. And yet he left it easy for them to try if that would win upon them to return to him. And the troubles threatened might therefore be prevented. So if you look at it, the truth is really that this demise at the hand of Nebuchadnezzar was God ordained. And any attempt to rescue themselves from that situation that failed to involve God was doomed to failure, including turning to Egypt. The only way they're going to save themselves is to turn to God, which they're not doing. They're turning any way they can except God. You know, sometimes I think it's almost like they haven't forgotten God, they're just deliberately rebelling. And they're thinking to themselves, I'm going to sort this out myself. I'm not going to turn to God, I'm going to do it on my own. And I'm sure most of us have been there as well. Yes, so let's read verses 11 to 15. Then the word of the Lord came to me. Say this to rebellious house. Do you not know what these things mean? Say to them, the king of Babylon went to Jerusalem and carried off her king and her nobles, bringing them back with him to Babylon. Then he took a member of the royal family and made a treaty with him, putting him under oath. He also carried away the leading men of that land, so that the kingdom would be brought low, unable to rise again, surviving only by keeping this treaty. But the king rebelled against him by sending his envoys to Egypt with horses and a large army. Will he succeed? Will he who does such things escape? Will he break the treaty and yet escape? Now, you don't need me to tell you, God has always spoken to us. The first recorded conversation between man and God was in the Garden of Eden, the one that we read about, and God called out, "Where are you?" And incidentally, that wasn't because God didn't know where Adam was. It's because he wanted Adam to admit where he was. So God called out, "Where are you?" The first conversation recorded between God and man. And he's been speaking to his creation ever since. The method uses, as I said earlier on this evening, varies from person to person. We all have to learn whichever method it is that God chooses to speak to us personally. God spoke to Abraham in a vision, yet he spoke to the boy Samuel out loud. And the one thing that all of these people have got in common is they all come to know God's voice and recognize it. And Ezekiel is no exception. So every time he says, "The word of the Lord came to me," he is sure that he is passing on God's message. And at the start of this riddle, when Ezekiel talks about the great eagle with powerful rings, he starts it off with the words, "The word of the Lord came to me." So he is sure that, strange as it might seem to him, this is what God is telling him to say. And out of curiosity, I had a casual flick through the book of Ezekiel. That phrase, "Then the word of the Lord came to me," is used 39 times approximately. And that doesn't include the visions he had. And some of these, "the word of the Lord came to me," are precisely dated by the prophet. And so it's safe to assume that every time he uses the phrase, "Then the word of the Lord came to me," it means that he's heard a new message from God. And so rather than looking at this book as a whole continuous prophecy from start to end, it's obvious that these words that he's got to give are being given to him in sections, a little bit at a time, with a gap in between. So this means that there may well have been a period of time between when Ezekiel gave this riddle and parable to the people and when God gave the explanation to them. Ellicott puts it, "Moreover, the word of the Lord, the form of expression, leaves it uncertain whether the explanation of the parable was given at the same time with the parable itself, or whether, as is more probable, a little time was suffered to elapse, during which it should be a riddle to the people, so that they might be the more attentive to its meaning when it was given to them." In other words, God was hoping that this riddle was going to get people thinking, was going to get people wondering what the answer was and trying to work it out for themselves. And the hope from God was that this would lead people to repentance, that they managed to work out what the riddle was and why they've ended up where they are and turn back to God again. That was the ultimate hope. We know now that with hindsight it didn't happen. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel to say, "Say to this rebellious house, do you not know what these things mean?" And that on its own tells me for certain that it didn't have the desired effect. This riddle that God posed them made no difference at all to their behavior. John Gill explains it. "Know ye not what these things mean? The riddle and parable concerning the two eagles and the vine, suggesting that they must be very inattentive and very stupid if they did not know the meaning of them. For though the things intended were delivered in an enigmatical and parabolical way, yet they were easily to be understood by all that know the affairs of the Jewish nation, being things that were lately transacted there, and were obvious to everyone's view. But if they were so stupid and blockish as not to understand them, the prophet had the following order to explain to them. And so God goes on to instruct Ezekiel to enlighten the people as to what the parable means. And God ends this explanation with, will he get away with breaking the treaty as he did and escape? Verse 16, just that one verse. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, he shall die in Babylon, in the land of the king who put him on the throne, whose oath he despised and whose treaty he broke. So in the next question, God answers that question with a promise and a prophetic word. The promise was, as surely as I live. The prophecy, he says that Zedekiah will die in the land of the king who put him on the throne. And you know, this harks back to chapter 12, when God prophesied Zedekiah's demise through Ezekiel. When he had, if you remember, he had Ezekiel knock a hole in the wall and climb through it and pretending he was escaping under darkness. And this was all indicative of Zedekiah's attempts to break out of Jerusalem through a wall and get away. And now God is referring to it again with a prophecy. Saying that it's not going to happen. You are not going to get away with it. You are going to die in the land of Babylon. And he did try it all the same, in spite of this prophecy. But as we know, he was captured. He and his leaders, his army was scattered all over the place. He was taken before King Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah in Syria, where his sons were slain in his presence. And he, being a disloyal vassal, was blinded and carried in chains to Babylon, where he was imprisoned until his death. Doesn't that tell you that they obviously didn't put much store on the prophet's words? You know, in spite of the fact that they've been proved right in the past, they've been proved that they're telling what God wants them to hear, and still, rebellion is the only word you can use. You know, they are deliberately ignoring these prophecies and not believing them. Perhaps I'm one on my own, but if a prophet told me that if you do that, God says you're going to die, I most certainly wouldn't do it. I was very good at learning lessons from my brothers. If one of them fell out of a tree and hurt himself, I said, I'm not climbing that tree, that's going to hurt. Okay, verses 17 and 18. Pharaoh with his mighty army and his great horde will be of no help to him in a war, when ramps are built and siege works erected to destroy many lives. He despised the oath by breaking the covenant, because he had given his hand in pledge, and yet he did all these things. He shall not escape. So God goes on to say, after prophesying that Zedekiah is going to die in the land of Babylon, to say that the Pharaoh of Egypt, whom Zedekiah has turned to, will be of no help when the king of Babylon comes against him, whom incidentally Zedekiah has wronged by breaking an oath. Even though Pharaoh has a mighty army of hordes of soldiers, he will be powerless to help Jerusalem when the siege works are erected to take the city. God is revealing that Zedekiah will not get away with his act of treachery. And it is, God says, because he gave his hand in pledge to the king of Babylon and yet reneged on the deal treacherously. And interestingly, if you look back at Jeremiah to chapter 52 and verses 6 to 9, that also talks about Zedekiah's downfall. So it's not only Ezekiel that's prophesying it, Jeremiah's telling him as well. It's coming from two directions, and he's still not listening.
Yes, even in Jeremiah 24, while this was going on in Babylon, Jeremiah had a vision the very good things were the exiles in Babylon. The bad things were that remnant, that rebellious remnant that was in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
That's amazing that how sin can cause delusion, I suppose, that you think you're right.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yep, can't argue with that. Okay, verses 19 and 21. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. As surely as I live, I will bring down on his head my oath that he despised and my covenant that he broke. I will spread my net for him, and he will be caught in my snare. I will bring him to Babylon and execute judgment upon him there, because he was unfaithful to me. All his fleeing troops will fall by the sword, and the survivors will be scattered to the winds. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken. So when the conquering king chose a puppet king to rule a newly conquered city in his stead, as Nebuchadnezzar has done here with Zedekiah, it was common for that puppet king, Zedekiah, to be made to swear allegiance to their new masters by the gods they worshipped. In this case of Zedekiah, it was Yahweh. And so Zedekiah would have been made to swear an oath by Yahweh that he would stay true in his allegiance to Babylon, that he would rule as a vassal king and remember that Nebuchadnezzar was his master. He swore that in the name of Yahweh. And so that is why God regarded the breaking of that oath as an affront to himself. Taylor puts it like this: when Zedekiah broke his covenant with the king of Babylon, he also committed treason against Yahweh himself. God regarded it not only as an oath to Nebuchadnezzar, but also to him. The implications of this attitude are far-reaching. It indicates that agreements entered into and obligations incurred by worshippers of God are as binding as if they had been made with God in person. You know, that makes you think, doesn't it? It obviously didn't make Zedekiah think. And you know, Jeremiah had repeatedly counseled Zedekiah and the other Judeans that they should have surrendered themselves to the Babylonians and to the judgment of God, which was ordained for the Babylonians to bring to them. But he didn't. And as a result of breaking this oath, God says he will bring down on his head the oath that he despised and the covenant that he broke. He says he will spread his net for Zedekiah and he will be caught in his trap. He promises to bring him to Babylon and execute judgment on him there. He prophesies also that the troops with him will be scattered and killed by the sword. And once again, God is keen to know that they should realize that this is coming from him, that this is not just random chance brought about by an invading army. This is all part of God's plan. Yeah, do you mind if we go on a bit longer? We haven't got far to go now to the end of the chapter. We'll read verses 22 to the end. This is what the sovereign Lord says: I myself will take a shoot from the very top of a cedar and plant it. I will break off a tender sprig from its topmost shoots and plant it on a high and lofty mountain. On the mountain heights of Israel I will plant it, and it will produce branches and bear fruit and become a splendid cedar. Birds of every kind will nest in it. They will find shelter in the shade of its branches. All the trees of the field will know that I, the Lord, bring down the tall tree and make the low tree grow tall. I dry up the green leaf and make the dry tree flourish. I, the Lord, have spoken, and I will do it. So last week, I mentioned just now, we talked about God seeming to be an angry God. And here, if we need it, is further evidence from the mouth of God that he is not an angry and vindictive God. Because as well as prophesying the forthcoming punishment for Zedekiah for breaking this oath, and indeed for the city. God is now talking about the restoration of Israel. And in a scene reminiscent of the eagle at the start of chapter 17, God says he will pluck a shoot from the top of the cedar and plant it. And remember, we said that the cedar tree is a metaphor for the lineage of King David and therefore right down to Christ. If you read the Bridgeway Bible commentary, it says, returning to the former illustration, Ezekiel shows that God, not an eagle, will now take a branch from the top of the cedar tree. He will plant it on the top of a mountain where it will grow into a huge and magnificent tree, bringing benefits to birds and animals of all kinds. From the Davidic line of kings, God will take one, the Messiah, and through him establish a kingdom that will bring blessings to the whole world. High trees will be made low and green trees will dry up, but God's tree will flourish. In brackets, the nations such as Babylon and Egypt will perish, but God's kingdom will be exalted. God undertakes himself now the reviving and restoring of the house of David. Nebuchadnezzar was the great eagle that had attempted the re-establishing of the house of David in a dependence upon himself. But the attempt miscarried. His plant was plucked up and withered. Well, says God, the next shall be of my planting. I will also take the highest branch of the cedar and I will set it. And note, just as men have got their designs, God has got his design as well. But his will prosper when men's are blasted. Nebuchadnezzar prided himself in setting up kingdoms at his pleasure. But those kingdoms soon came to an end. Whereas God of heaven sets up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Kaufman notes, here we have a striking prediction of the kingdom of the Messiah. And the chapter ends with this promise. God says, I have spoken and I will do it. And that's where we'll end it for tonight. Amen.